are listening to a Freedom Student Ministry podcast.
And I'm going to talk about a guy named Daniel. He's one of my favorite characters in the Bible. I've got hundreds of favorite characters in the Bible, but I love Daniel. And the reason I chose Daniel tonight is because of the topic of leadership and the topic of living in a land that is ungodly, that's godless, that is not God-fearing, not God-loving. And how do we do it, And Daniel is such a great example who was, probably when he was captured by the Babylonians, and I'll explain that in a minute, he was not that much older than you guys. So, it's really relatable. And just real quick about Daniel, he was raised with God's people in Israel, and he knew God, and he was taught God's ways, and he loved God, and he lived a faithful life. Something happened. There was a huge invasion of the Babylonians coming from far east with a king named Nebuchadnezzar, came in, swept in. It had all been predicted. God warned the people because they had left him. He warned them this was going to happen. And sure enough, in come these Babylonians, strong, mighty army, ruthless people, come in and take all of God's people back to Babylon, all except for a few poor people. They just left to tend the land, and they weren't worth anything to the Babylonians, so they left them. But they took everybody else. And one of the things that they did was they would pick out some of the very best of the best. So if you were any kind of nobility, any kind of intelligence, any kind of good looks or physique or strength, intellect, any of that, you might get chosen. You might wish you weren't that for once in your life if you were in the hands of the Babylonians, because that's who would be picked to come and serve in higher levels within the Babylonian government. Well, Daniel was one of those guys. He was... You don't have your phone out, do you? Okay, good. I wasn't sure. And so he was chosen as one of a handful that went to serve in the palace, in the upper levels with the government under Nebuchadnezzar. I don't want to, there's so much to the story I want to tell you, but I think I'm just going to pick out a couple things about Daniel and how he lived his life in that place. Because Babylonian, by the way, has a lot of similarities to our country. Not all the same. We aren't quite as ruthless and harsh and evil in the same ways that Babylon was. But, and they had a dictator who just whatever he said went. We don't have that kind of governing authority, thankfully. But there was a lot of worldliness, a lot of just love of material things, no knowledge of God or care for God, a lot of arrogance, a lot of pride, a lot of luxury among the rich. But the poor were the poor, and they're the ones who served the rich. The rich were rich, and the poor were poor, and they were slaves or captives or... And there's just a lot of sexual immorality. Sometimes we think these are the bad days when it comes to sexual immorality. It's been true in the human race from the beginning of sin that humans have taken something good and beautiful like sexuality and turned into something that looks ugly or is awful and shameful instead of what it was meant to be. There's cheating, there's lying, there's all of this stuff going on, this corruption in the government, all of that is happening, and this is the life that Daniel suddenly finds himself in with some of his friends as well with him. And so I just want to look at 5 things that I picked out of Daniel's life that are just amazing quality characters that I think sustained him while he was living in Babylon. These same things, even though this was, 4,000 years ago maybe, still today will sustain you in the culture that you live in and in the world that you live in, the school you go to, the city you live in. And so I'm just going to, I just want to walk through those just for a second, and then we'll be done. Not long. The first thing that I noticed, and I could name more than 5, but the first thing that I noticed about him is he had his priorities right. The number one thing that was important to Daniel in his life was that he worshiped God. So even though there was a law that was made that says no praying to any other god except the king Nebuchadnezzar, he did it anyway. And as a result, he got thrown into a cave with these starving lions that normally would have torn him to pieces, but God intervened, and that's an amazing story in itself. But he was faithful to God. He knew his life would be on the line. He did not compromise. And so that's, I should have had a whiteboard to write him up, but that's number one, is he did not compromise what was most important. And that's so, ask yourself, so do I compromise my faith with Jesus Christ when I'm with my friends or at school? Do I try to hide that? Do I act like those around me when I know that's not Christ-like way, but I compromise? Or maybe I just choose to use my time in another way rather than seeking God and giving time to him. Are you compromising? If you're compromising, you're not going to be ready for harder days that are coming ahead. You're not going to be able to stand when you're tested in your faith. You're going to fall, to be honest. If you are not putting Jesus first in your life, you will fall. Daniel knew that. He had his priorities right. Number one was God, and he didn't compromise. He still prayed publicly. He was actually in his house, but he did it right by the window where everybody could see, and sure enough, they did. He wasn't afraid. He knew he put everything on the line for Jesus. So that was my number one thing I noticed. Second, So my second one, and this I would put first actually, is his priority, and this is kind of tied together, that's why, but his prayer. His prayer was number one, and the reason for prayer is because that's where we get to know God. We say, God, okay, here's my heart. Show, this is who I am. Will you show me who you are? And that it's where we build our relationship with Jesus. If you're not praying, you're not going to get to know him. You're only going to hear about him and know stuff here, but it's not going to change your life, and it's not going to help you stand firm and strong when things get tough, or when there's pressure, or when there's trials in your life. You've got to be praying and learning how to pray. And it's not a boring, dead sort of thing. It is one of the most wonderful things in my life. It's what gives me life and joy and energy every day, is that time with Jesus. So that's the second, is prayer. Karen, do you want to write that up there? Write prayer as the second one. Third, all throughout the book of Daniel, by the way, in the Bible, there is a small book in there called Daniel, and it's all about his life. The first 6 chapters are the most fun books to read if you ever want to read a story about somebody's life. Okay, so the third thing is that all through the book of Daniel, he always respected and honored authority. He worked for the worst boss in the world. I mean, Nebuchadnezzar was so full of himself, and he was so haughty, and he was a braggart, and he thought he himself had the powers of God, and he was a deity, and he would just use and abuse people however he felt like he wanted to. He was king. So, and that's who he worked for. And Daniel was nothing to him. He could have just gotten rid of him in a second, beheaded him in a second, and there would be no problem. That's what the king says. That's what But Daniel always spoke with such respect whenever he came before Nebuchadnezzar. Paul and Lena, could you guys pay attention up here? Okay, Paul especially. So anytime he came before Nebuchadnezzar, he treated him with utmost respect. And I love that. So I'm just asking you, how about you with the authorities in your life, starting with your parents? Do you respect them? Do you honor them? When you're not with them, do you talk about them to your friends in a God-honoring way, in a way that you would say the same thing to their face? Do you do what they ask you to do? Sometimes we're passively dishonoring. We just don't do what they say, and we just kind of and we walk away. We're not honoring or respecting. How about teachers in your life? Even if it's a teacher that is not a good teacher, there are some out there, and some of them can be really difficult to get along with, a different personality, but can you still respect and honor them because you love God? Maybe it's harder to respect and honor them because I had a teacher that just didn't deserve any respect and honor. He acted like a junior high student. It was very irresponsible, I remember. And yet, no matter what, he was an authority over me, and I needed to respect and honor him. How about the President of the United States? So we're talking about elections. how do we talk about him, and how do we respond to the laws of our governing authorities? Those kinds of things are really important. And Daniel did that really well. Everything that he could do to keep the law, he did, as long as it still honored his God, as long as he still, number one was God's law, and then under that was the government law. So sometimes that can be really difficult, but in our land it's not quite as difficult as some places. But so honoring and respecting authority. Fourth, let's see, a simple way to just put excellence. So Daniel filled his role with excellence. Whatever he did it well. He was working for a pagan king in a pagan culture, but he fulfilled his role well. He did it excellently, and that's why he rose to become prime minister. That's actually what his role ended up being, because he was respected because he did so well. And so asking you yourself, how well do I do simply my chores at home? Do I do it excellently? If I do, I'll be honored. God will be honored. How about your homework? Are you putting your best into it? I'm not talking about grades. I'm talking about how much work and effort do you put into just doing simply your best. That's different than grades. Doing your best before God. How are you doing with that? Do it excellently. God will honor that. And if you have a job, or if you're on the drama team, or if you're in sports, are you doing it with your utmost best? Because that honors God, and you will receive honor in the end as well. People will start noticing you in life when you do excellent and the best you can do in what you do, no matter how small it is, no matter how big it is. And then the last, the last one. You can just put relationship with brothers. Daniel could never have stood strong alone, and he had around him a couple of guys with the funniest names, Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, but they were also just like him. I know those names just quick off my tongue because there's a song that goes with it, and I learned them since I first met Jesus. Anyway, so those three guys also had the same values and loved God, did excellent. They also rose up in the ranks because they were trustworthy, responsible. They stood out from all the rest. And Daniel, when he was in a tight spot, he knew he was going to be thrown into a cave with hungry lions. He went to them first and said, pray, just pray, because we need to pray. Something's going on here, and my life is on the line. They prayed for him, and you guys got to have that in your life too. You can have lots of friends, but you've got to have a few close brothers or sisters that are believers in Christ, who have the same values, who can pray for you. You can call them up. You say, pray for me, because I'm about to explode with anger and I can't contain it. Please pray for me. Pray for me because I'm just struggling in this class, or because it's just really hard at home. I'm feeling lonely. All kinds of reasons to call that brother and sister and ask for their help. So to have those kind of relationships will help you too when things are harder, and when they're good, you got some people to celebrate with too, which is really cool. And Daniel, he was blessed, he was honored, he was remembered. He's one of the most godly men, I think, in the Bible, of character. And as a result, I think God really entrusted him with some spiritual gifts. He was able to interpret the dream of the king. All the magicians had tried, all these other spiritual sort of guys tried to do it. They couldn't do it. But Daniel could, because God gave him a gift. But he was trustworthy. That's because he was trustworthy. He had been good at excelling in his work. He had character and integrity. He was prayerful. He was seeking God. So God trusted him with this amazing gift, supernatural gift, right? Usually you can't interpret dreams. In fact, in one of the stories, the king was so uptight about it. He says, I'm not even going to tell anybody what my dream is. You have to tell me what my dream is and interpret it. So he couldn't fake it. You had to really know, from God what that dream was. And sure enough, God gave him that ability and that gift. And I want the gifts of the Holy Spirit. I want the ability to speak, really like clear words from God into somebody's life. Sometimes that's called prophetic. words. I want to be able to do that. I want to be able to minister mercy in a deep, healing way to somebody. But I've got to first get my life, in line with God first. And when He sees that I'm responsible and honorable, and in a sense that He can trust me with those gifts, He will give them. He gives them. He does. And so, anyway, it's all for you guys too. All those things are true for you and available to you too.
You have just been listening to a Freedom Student Ministry podcast.